In 1881, Dakota Territory, USA, tribal elder Wikasa Wahinajin was found barefoot and motionless at the edge of the Cannonball River, his skin darkened by sun and fever, his mouth sewn shut with horsehair, one of the few remaining visible members of a Lakota band whose entire winter camp, 119 individuals, had vanished over the span of 3 weeks. The children's hides were still stretched on frames, half-tanned, and the cooking fires still smoldered under frozen broth. Wikasa's eyes were wide open but unseeing, and the U.S. Army physician who examined him recorded no wounds, only a persistent odor of mildew and bile emanating from his sweat. Army records had noted the band as compliant and sedentary, engaged in treaty farming near Fort Yates, with all supplies accounted for and no signs of conflict. Yet by the spring thaw their cabins stood empty and sealed, and their ration logs ended abruptly on February 3, 1881. That winter, the snow had come early and bitter, and a telegram from Fort Lincoln mentioned an unidentified illness spreading through the Missouri Basin, fever without rash, diarrhea without pain, and silence without warning. In the cavalry manifest, a civilian translator added a single line beside the Lakota file: "No burial, no bodies, no sound." Who recorded the last sighting? And why was it struck from the official ledger? The 119 were described in bureau files as stable, industrious, and loyal treaty families, led by Wikasa Wahinajin, a reformed buffalo hunter who now held Sunday lessons in English prayer and wore government-issue wool vests. Yet in an unsent letter found in a lockbox beneath Fort Yates, a junior clerk noted that every evening since the frost, the cabins exhale a sour smell, and that rations delivered weekly were returned untouched by the dozens, prompting a covert review of the census logs. Voce now continue with Chapter 1, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script the beginning of the escalation, where you will report the first concrete signs that something is wrong. Introduce witnesses, neighbors, or official records that mention unusual changes. Describe scenes with sensory depth, e.g. creaking doors, dust in the air, etc. Reinforce the atmosphere of strangeness and apprehension. This part must contain between 1,100 and 500 words. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words such as unbelievable, attention, etc. Allowed examples: unbelievable, attention, okay. Do not use forbidden characters, tinit, bisios lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 1, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Rotirista Ingles, Longa Horror, Dice. It began with a change in the air, dry, metallic, and bitter. By late December 1880, the Missouri River froze solid north of Bismarck, and the wind coming off its surface carried a faint, unnatural stench that seasoned scouts said did not belong to ice or game or wood smoke. At Fort Yates, just 10 miles south, Army Surgeon Dr. Elijah Torwood noted in his journal that several Lakota children presented with inexplicable symptoms: bloodless lips, jaundiced eyes, and a persistent humming in the chest. None cried, none coughed. They simply sat on their heels, rocking gently, whispering among themselves in a tongue Torwood could not place. The 119 residents of the southeastern allotment, mostly Manikowoju Lakota, had been under federal supervision since the ratification of the 1877 Act. Known as Block 6 on the military census, the group was formally documented as agriculturally engaged, Christianized, and literate in both Lakota and English. But by the third week of January 1881, all government interactions with Block 6 became erratic. Food distributions were refused, teaching schedules cancelled, and mail deliveries went unclaimed. At first, authorities blamed the weather. Then they blamed a clerical error. On January 19th, Sergeant Abel Fitzpatrick was dispatched to conduct a routine welfare inspection. He crossed the snowbound plain on horseback and reached the cluster of 23 cabins just before dusk. What he found was recorded in his field log and later corroborated under oath before a bureau tribunal. The doors were shut, not locked, and each one opened to reveal homes frozen in place, pots still on the stove, quilts mid-stitch, fires burned to ash. In one cabin, a tea kettle continued to steam though the room was empty. In another, a Bible was open to Matthew 24, with a child's mitten placed as a marker. Fitzpatrick described no signs of violence or looting, only a thick layer of dust on the windowsills and an overwhelming odor he called rotted linen and river silt. He encountered no people. On his return, Fitzpatrick was unable to speak for several hours, and when prompted only repeated the phrase, "They weren't taken, they went quiet." The phrase was entered into his disciplinary report for insubordination. 2 days later, a new witness surfaced. Sister Eloise Bennett, a missionary with the Catholic Bureau of Indian Missions, had served weekly at the small chapel erected at the center of Block 6. She told Fort Yates officials that attendance had abruptly dropped from 60 to none within 8 days. She had sent letters to 4 families, then walked the 3 miles through snow to deliver them in person. According to her deposition taken February 5th, she never reached the cabins. She stopped when she saw what she described as rows of footprints leading in, but never leading out. The snow past the threshold was unbroken. Sister Eloise had taken with her a personal Bible and a tin of cloves, which she used to chew during her long walks to numb the taste of smoke and frostbite. That afternoon, she bit into one, then spat it out when the clove turned to ash in her mouth. She claimed the air grew warmer the closer she stepped toward the village, though the sun had already begun to drop and her breath still froze. Upon returning to the fort, she washed her face, recited the Magnificat 3 times and locked herself in her quarters for 4 days. Despite these early warnings, Fort Yates maintained the official record that the Lakota families had relocated, voluntarily to higher ground or to relatives near the Standing Rock Agency. Captain Lauren Greaves ordered the census be updated to reflect a temporary dispersal. When asked why none of the horses or sleds had been removed, he replied that tribal movement patterns often defied logic and should not be interpreted using Western assumptions. But the following week, mail carrier Arnold Thresher violated that order. Thresher had worked the southern post route since 1879, delivering packages, letters, and supplies across the barren expanses between the scattered outposts. On February 10th, he reported hearing what he believed to be singing from a group of women along the river bend. The melody was faint, nearly drowned by the wind, but distinctly human. He veered his sled off course and approached the sound, expecting to find a gathering or burial ritual. Instead, he found the empty gathering circle behind the Block 6 chapel. The fire pit was cold, and the benches dusted with untouched snow. In his testimony, he wrote, "I kept hearing them after I'd stopped moving, but it wasn't coming from the wind, it was inside my own ears." That same night, Thresher was found by a patrol unit 10 miles west, barefoot, stumbling and incoherent. His boots were missing, his socks stiff with ice. His sled was abandoned. He was treated for exposure and remained hospitalized at Fort Abraham Lincoln for 10 days. During that time, he reportedly muttered a string of repeating Lakota phrases, which translators could not decipher. When he recovered, he refused to return to Fort Yates and submitted his resignation by telegram. Meanwhile, back at the fort, new documentation quietly began to surface. Inventory ledgers from the agency storehouse revealed a discrepancy in the flour and lard allotments. Between January 4th and February 3rd, Block 6 had returned nearly 80% of its rations untouched. One entry, dated January 27th, showed 4 barrels of hardtack left stacked at the rear of the chapel. When asked why, the quartermaster responded, "They said the food had no taste." But more troubling was the personal journal of Reverend Amos Toller, a Presbyterian field minister tasked with evangelizing the outer reaches of the reservation. He visited Block 6 once a month, often staying overnight in the guest quarters of the Wahinajin household. In his final entry dated February 1st, 1881, he described arriving to find the front door ajar, the hearth still warm, and an unfinished hymn sheet pinned to the wall. He wrote, I called Wikasa's name twice, then 3 times, then again in Lakota. No voice returned, but I heard a bowl clatter on the table, as if someone had just left the room. Tola left the premises shortly after sundown. He died 5 days later, of what was reported as pneumonia, but his body was interred without ceremony and without an autopsy. His journal was passed to a temporary records officer at Fort Yates, then vanished from the official archives. Its surviving contents were transcribed from a copy made by his niece in Chicago, who never received an explanation for its omission. By mid-February, rumors had spread beyond the Dakota Territory. An inquiry letter arrived from the Chicago office of the Indian Rights Association, questioning the census redactions. It was signed by Elias Merton, an independent investigator and former surveyor with the Department of the Interior. He requested to visit Fort Yates personally and review Block 6 records. His request was neither approved nor denied. No formal reply was ever sent. Yet Merton boarded a train west the following week. Vosedis now continue with Chapter 1, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, beginning of the escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly, Chapter 1, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles Longa Horror Dice, Elias Merton stepped off the Northern Pacific railcar at Bismarck on February 22, 1881, wearing a double-breasted wool coat and a grey felt hat that had faded from travel dust. A surveyor's satchel hung at his side, heavy with copies of land patents, census rolls, and army requisition logs. His papers were in order, though he presented himself not as an agent of law, but as a concerned citizen with a background in documentation. He had served as a map draftsman during the Black Hills Survey in 1875 and understood the subtle language of erasure when absence was made official by paper. The journey from Bismarck to Fort Yates was treacherous that week, with sleet covering the roads and visibility reduced to a silver haze. Merton hired a Dakota scout named Albinus Claymore to guide him south along the frozen banks of the Missouri. Claymore spoke little, but pointed frequently, once to a stretch of charred prairie where an agency barn had burned during the previous winter, and again to the tree line where several U.S. Army scouts had vanished during a snowstorm in 1879. "The wind carries things west," he said at one point, tapping his chest, "but some things it does not give back." They reached Fort Yates after nightfall. Merton was issued a cot in the surveyor's quarters and met briefly with Acting Commander Nathan Reeve. Reeve, a stiff man with a bristled mustache and an artificial eye, dismissed Merton's questions with clipped answers. He refused to release the Block 6 census logs and suggested the Lakota families had likely merged with itinerant bands near Pine Ridge. When Merton asked why no notice of relocation had been filed, Reeve paused, then replied, "They weren't under detention. We do not track their every move." But that same night, a low-ranking orderly named Bennett Lane approached Merton outside the mess hall with a folded scrap of parchment. It was a map, hand-drawn and faint, showing the original Block 6 boundary, but marked with red ink in places the official survey did not include. A shallow ravine behind the chapel, a cluster of storage pits north of the settlement, and a symbol Merton did not recognize drawn beside a dried creek bed. "There's something under the ground," Lane said quietly. "We filled it in, on orders." The next morning, Merton ventured out alone. The ravine had already thawed slightly in the midday light, and the snow that remained formed uneven mounds around exposed stones and broken tools. He climbed into the gully, brushing past stiff branches and catching the hem of his coat on a rusted iron hook embedded in the soil. There were fragments of wood beams, a patch of soot on the dirt, and an acrid smell, faint but distinct, like lamp oil left too long in the sun. At the northern edge of the settlement, he found the cabins, silent and intact with doors closed tight. He approached one, knocked once, then twice, and pushed gently inward. The hinges creaked, but did not resist. Inside, the air was stale and oddly humid. Dust hung visibly in the light that spilled through a single window, and a trail of small circular stains dotted the wooden floor, leading toward a ladder that descended into a root cellar. Merton hesitated. Then he lit a match. The ladder groaned as he climbed down, and the earth smelled sour and wet. The cellar was no more than 6 feet square, but the walls were lined with empty jars. On the far side, resting against the dirt, was a large basin filled with something blackened and gelatinous. It emitted no steam and bore no sign of rot, yet the air felt heavy around it, almost slow. As Merton leaned closer, he saw that several of the jars had been wiped clean on the inside, yet contained short, curled fibers, brownish-grey and coarse. Not hair, not string. He collected one in his handkerchief and returned to the surface. Later that day, he interviewed a field teacher named Ruth Magill, who had served in the Block 6 schoolhouse until it closed unexpectedly in mid-January. She had returned to Illinois, then come back to Fort Yates once word of the missing families reached her cousin in Bismarck. In her statement to Merton, she said the children had stopped responding to roll call during her final week of teaching. They would sit at their desks, staring at their slates. They didn't blink. I would ask them a question and they would smile but not speak. I thought perhaps it was a game. She recalled one particular morning, January 13th, when she found the classroom empty despite no snow or storm overnight. Chalk messages had been scrawled on the walls in English and Lakota, phrases like, "We do not eat the grain," and "He is still awake." Magill assumed it was a prank, cleaned the boards, and reported the incident. Her superior, a civilian liaison named Hartwell Cray, dismissed it as symbolic resistance to Christian discipline. She was not called to testify when the census was altered. In a final attempt to locate physical evidence, Merton requested access to the agency's infirmary logbooks. The chief medical officer, Dr. Torwood, permitted him only 5 minutes of supervised review. But in that time, Merton noted 3 entries from late January referencing systemic shutdown with no infection, pupils dilated without response, and one that read simply, external, calm internal absence. The names of the patients were all listed as unrecorded minors. Merton copied these entries in shorthand, then requested permission to exhume the cellar pit he had found. The request was denied by Acting Commander Reeve, who claimed jurisdictional limits and impending thaw made excavation unsafe. When Merton threatened to escalate the matter to the Department of the Interior, Reeve warned that unauthorized digging on Army property would constitute trespass and result in immediate arrest. That night, Merton placed the jar fibers into a wax envelope, sealed it, and prepared a letter to a colleague at the Chicago Natural History Museum requesting chemical analysis. He intended to mail it at dawn, but he never did. At sunrise, a janitor at the Fort Yates barracks found Merton's room unoccupied. His satchel remained on the desk, along with his notes, clothing, and gloves. His boots stood by the door, still damp with melted snow. The envelope was untouched. Witnesses claimed to have seen him walking east toward the riverbank just before daybreak, wearing no coat and holding a tin of matches. His trail disappeared halfway through the snowfield, though no new snow had fallen. A search was conducted but yielded nothing. By March 2nd, the Bureau closed the inquiry and issued a revised statement. The 119 had been voluntarily relocated, and no further investigation was necessary. Block 6 was struck from the reservation map. New survey lines were drawn. The official file on Elias Merton was moved to the Department of the Interior Archives in Chicago, labeled incomplete. Vosegici now continue with Chapter 2, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script escalation, where you will show how events become more disturbing and impossible to ignore. Introduce external figures, investigators, journalists, authorities, religious figures, and their first impressions. Add contradictions, disappearance of evidence, and conflicting accounts. Increase the tension with every sentence, preparing the viewer for the climax. This part must contain between 1,000 and 2,500 words. Continue the chapter, without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify: do not use full capital words, do not use forbidden characters, ditiudi. Taisu lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Rotirista Ingalls Longa Horror. Dice. The first article appeared in the March 14, 1881 edition of the Chicago Sentinel, buried below fold in the National Dispatches section. The headline read, "Surveyor Missing, Alleged Irregularities at Dakota Post." The byline carried the name Richard Dobbins, a junior correspondent recently transferred from the crime desk. The article was brief, just 12 sentences, but it described an unnamed source at Fort Yates who had witnessed a federal inspector vanish while investigating suspicious census activity. Dobbins concluded his report with a single line that attracted little attention at the time. No graves, no names, and no conclusions permitted. 2 days later, Dobbins boarded a train west. He carried with him a carbon copy of Elias Merton's final letter, which had arrived at the Sentinel offices without a return address. Enclosed in the same envelope was a curled gray fiber sealed in wax paper, the color of ash and the texture of boiled parchment. Dobbins consulted a chemist at the Field Museum who examined the sample under a magnifying lens and concluded it was biological, but not botanical, nor hair, nor hide. When pressed for more, the chemist declined to elaborate. When Dobbins arrived in Bismarck on March 20th, he was met by silence. The telegraph operator at the station claimed no one by the name of Merton had passed through in February. The postmaster denied handling any packages addressed to Chicago. Dobbins rented a mule and traveled south alone. His journal from that period, later recovered by his editor, began with an observation: "The wind speaks too clearly here. It does not whistle, it narrates." On March 21st, he reached Fort Yates and requested a meeting with Acting Commander Reeve, who refused to acknowledge the purpose of his visit. Instead, Reeve offered Dobbins lodging for one night and warned him not to interfere with classified agency business. That evening, Dobbins slipped out of his quarters and made his way across the snow-dusted fields to the edge of Block 6. What he found was not what had been described in official records. The cabins remained, but many bore fresh scorch marks along their window frames. 2 had collapsed entirely, and the footprints in the surrounding snow suggested recent presence, too fresh for an abandoned site. Yet no fires burned, and no animals stirred. Inside one cabin, he found a thick census ledger nailed shut with copper tacks. In another, a child's boot sat atop a pile of ashes in a tin stove, perfectly upright, the leather singed but not destroyed. He returned before dawn and noted in his journal, "The silence here is not empty, it is withholding." Back in Chicago, the Sentinel began to receive anonymous telegrams, all unsigned, listing specific phrases from internal Fort Yates documentation. Each message included a date and the same sentence: "Records do not match inventory." The telegrams were routed through at least 3 different stations, Fargo, Sioux City, and Omaha, suggesting an internal leak from multiple sources. In April, a new figure entered the story. Reverend Matthew Croft, a Methodist preacher affiliated with the Dakota Evangelical Commission, visited Fort Yates to assess irregularities in mission engagement. His authority was limited, but his presence posed a nuisance to the administrative staff. Croft began by conducting interviews with support personnel, cooks, janitors, and clerks. Over several days, he compiled statements about food returns, schoolhouse closures, and inventory inconsistencies. But on the morning of April 6th, his travel case was discovered open outside the barracks, and 2 of his notebooks were missing. Croft filed an official complaint, which was forwarded to the Office of Indian Affairs in Washington. The complaint vanished en route. Simultaneously, a new contradiction emerged. The official relocation report for Block 6 listed 11 host families from the Pine Ridge Reservation who had allegedly received the missing Lakota individuals. Yet when contacted, Pine Ridge authorities denied any such arrivals. No new dwellings had been constructed, no ration allotments had increased, no names matched. The name Wicasa Wahinajin, listed in the government manifest, appeared on a baptismal record at Standing Rock, dated February 3, 1881, one day after his community was marked as unresponsive in the Fort Yates log. The minister who signed the document, Reverend George Hallam, had died of exposure 2 weeks later. His church ledger was intact, but his personal diary, kept in the vestry, had its February entries torn out by hand. That spring, a regional inspection committee traveled to Dakota Territory on an unrelated mission concerning mineral rights. While en route, 2 commissioners visited Fort Yates without prior notice. Their unannounced arrival caused visible disruption, and multiple agency staff were seen removing crates from the records building late at night. One commissioner, Bernard Alton, later wrote in a private letter, "The files they offered us had already been sifted. Page numbers were missing. Statements were unsigned. No entries appeared between January 15th and March 3rd. Alton also reported meeting a man named Claymore, identified as a local scout, who had refused to shake hands and would not enter the main building. When asked if he had guided a surveyor in February, Claymore answered only, "I take men in. I do not take them out." By May, internal pressure forced the Bureau of Indian Affairs to initiate a quiet inquiry. They assigned an agent named Henry Bell, formerly of the Kansas City Land Office, to conduct interviews and confirm whether the Block 6 population had indeed relocated. Bell arrived on May 11th and submitted a preliminary memo within 48 hours. In it, he noted that the census rolls had been redrafted entirely and signed by individuals who had never been stationed at Fort Yates. One witness named Daniel Foy, listed as the quartermaster responsible for January ration logs, was found to have died in 1878. Bell's second memo, dated May 15th, included the statement, "Nothing here has a beginning or an end. Only interruptions." That same day, Bell checked out a horse from the cavalry stable and rode east toward the Cannonball River, seeking out any surviving members of the Lakota families who might have fled the reservation system entirely. He never returned. The horse was found 3 days later grazing near the riverbank, saddle intact, canteen full. The ground nearby showed signs of disturbance, deep impressions as if something heavy had been dragged, but no boot prints, no blood, no trail. Inside Bell's room, a set of notes was recovered. One page had a list of names from the 1879 census, all underlined in red. In the margin, a phrase had been scribbled in haste. "Still warm food in empty homes, still warm rooms with no people." By June, the Fort Yates record office suffered a fire. The flames consumed one filing room, including all census data for the winter months of 1880 and 1881. The fire was blamed on an overturned kerosene lamp, though no witnesses reported seeing any personnel present after sundown. The Bureau issued no further statements. Washington remained silent. But on the morning of July 2nd, one final account emerged. An unsigned letter postmarked from Yankton, South Dakota, addressed to the Chicago Sentinel. The letter described a night in late February when a man with no coat and a burned matchbook had been seen walking along the riverbank. The writer claimed to have followed him from a distance, believing him to be drunk. But when the man stopped and turned, his eyes did not reflect light. The letter closed with one final line. "We did not lose them. We traded them for silence." Você diz. Now continue with Chapter 2, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 2,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory. No exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, Do not write any additional commentary. Summary, prompt or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles longa hora dice, the unsigned letter from Yankton did not reach the newsroom directly. It had been intercepted by a Sentinel intern responsible for sorting correspondence addressed to missing reporter Richard Dobbins. It arrived folded twice inside a manila envelope with no return signature, only a faint grease stain on the lower right corner and handwriting that suggested trembling or advanced age. Its envelope bore a mismatched stamp, no post office seal, and was routed through a mail center that had shut down 6 years earlier. Upon reading the final sentence, "We did not lose them. We traded them for silence," the editor made a copy and filed it with the growing stack of unverified materials tied to Fort Yates. He then contacted Reverend Matthew Croft, whose correspondence had resumed from a sanatorium outside Omaha following what was described as a temporary collapse of moral equilibrium. Croft, in the week since his return, had begun to sketch compulsively, mostly diagrams of the settlement, spirals resembling crop furrows, and floor plans of cabins he had not entered. When asked about his missing notebooks, Croft responded with a vague recollection of an open drawer filled with snow, not paper. He then offered an odd detail. He remembered the distinct sound of scissors cutting through damp wool, a noise that continued long after he had left the room. He attributed the sound to a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation, but the doctor overseeing his care noted something more troubling in his patient log. Subject's hearing and smell remain unusually sensitive, reports detecting the scent of unwashed linen and something faintly metallic wherever he is placed. Back in Dakota Territory, the administrative turnover at Fort Yates continued quietly. Acting Commander Reeve was replaced in late July by Major Darren Heppel, who was not briefed in full regarding the earlier investigation. Heppel's orders were simple: restore order, maintain discipline, and ensure that press inquiries were deflected through official channels. On his first inspection of the Block 6 area, he brought with him a civilian cartographer, Thomas Kell, tasked with drafting updated land diagrams. Kell, a reserved man with a reputation for precision, completed his sketches in a single day. But the next morning he submitted a complaint to Heppel, claiming his maps had been tampered with. In the margin of one page, a series of markings had been added overnight. Narrow vertical lines, each precisely spaced, running from the top corner to the bottom. They did not match the ink or pen used in the original work. Kell insisted he had locked the pages in a storage case under his bedroll. No one else had access. Heppel dismissed the matter as exhaustion and ordered the markings removed. That same evening, Kell left the fort without authorization. He was found several days later at a trading post 60 miles south, refusing to speak, clenching both hands around a folded page of his map. When a doctor attempted to pry it loose, Kell bit his own tongue and bled profusely onto the paper, staining it beyond recovery. The page was never entered into the official archive. Meanwhile, new inconsistencies appeared in the medical records. Fort Yates physicians began to receive cases of compacted silence, a term coined by Dr. Reynold Murphy to describe patients who remained conscious but refused to respond to auditory or visual cues. These individuals, mostly from surrounding bands unaffiliated with Block 6, exhibited no outward signs of illness, but were often found seated in cold dwellings, hands folded neatly in their laps, eyes open and fixed toward doorways. In one instance, a young man named Hunter Skoo, age estimated at 17, was discovered inside the collapsed structure of a former chapel. He did not speak, but held a woven pouch containing fragments of dried food, 4 red beads, and a handful of tightly coiled fibers that matched those taken from the cellar jars. When the fibers were placed under a magnifying lens by Dr. Murphy, they appeared segmented, as if peeled from something once living. The pouch was placed in evidence. It vanished within a week. By late August, the once quiet affair at Fort Yates drew attention from more vocal political figures. Senator Hamel Bardsley of Illinois, an advocate for Western transparency, requested a formal hearing on administrative misconduct at the Dakota posts. The request was denied by committee vote, but several testimonies were submitted in writing. Among them was a statement by Ruth McGill, the former schoolteacher, who had returned east and taken a position in Iowa. McGill's letter described an episode from January that she had not disclosed previously. During her last days at Block 6, she claimed to have seen a procession, 8 to 10 figures wrapped in blankets, moving silently between the cabins at dusk. They carried no lanterns, made no sound. The figures passed directly outside her window and paused at the schoolhouse door. When she opened it the next morning, she found rows of children's slates laid neatly across the floor, each slate bearing only one word: hollow. No investigation followed. Her account was dismissed as emotional residue from traumatic departure. One final anomaly cemented the escalation. On September 12, 1881, a new postmaster arrived at Fort Yates to replace the former station master, who had died of what was reported as a cardiac episode. In sorting through the backlog of returned letters and misdirected packages, the postmaster discovered a canvas pouch containing several items: a military matchbook, a surveyor's field compass with initials EM, and a booklet of pressed paper covered in fine script. The script was in English but written in phonetic Lakota, detailing a chant or recitation not recorded in any known translation. The pouch was sealed and sent to the Department of War under escort. The shipment never reached Washington. The receipt of transfer, however, did. Signed by Major Heppel, the receipt bore an unusual note scrawled at the bottom margin: returned to origin, not to be housed. By October, no official trace of the 119 individuals remained in federal archives. Você disse, now continue with Chapter 3, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script confrontation or discovery. Report the most intense and revealing moment: discovery of bodies, files, forbidden objects, hidden rooms, etc. Describe every visual and auditory detail realistically, avoiding gratuitous gore but not concealing the gravity. Show the reactions of witnesses and authorities in the face of the revealed horror. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify: do not use full capital words, do not use forbidden characters, ditiudi. Lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Rotirista, Inglés Longa Horror, Dice. The frost returned early that year. On the first morning of October 1881, a ground mist settled thick around Fort Yates, obscuring the boundaries between river, land, and sky. Light filtered in thin bands, pale and lifeless, and the wind carried a smell that many could not name, but later described as cooled copper and boiled starch. It was during this unseasonable stillness that Private Nathan Orlis, posted to firewood duty near the periphery of Block 6, tripped over something buried just beneath the soil. At first he believed it was a tree root or a collapsed fence post, but his boot caught on an edge too regular, too deliberate, smooth on 3 sides, then jagged at the 4th. When he knelt to inspect it, brushing away frost and brittle grass, he uncovered the corner of a wooden hatch, no larger than a cellar door, with a rusted iron handle flush to the earth. There was no path leading to it, no trail. The door was unpainted, its grain grey with age. Orlis alerted his superior, who alerted Major Heppel. By midday, a small detachment gathered at the site. 2 officers, 1 physician, and the fort's records officer, Clerk Elmer Stoke. The door opened with resistance, hinges groaning against compacted earth. Below it, a narrow shaft descended into blackness. The ladder rungs had partially rotted but still held firm. Heppel ordered a lantern lit. The first to descend was Dr. Reynold Murphy. The shaft dropped only 10 feet, but what it opened into was not a cellar, it was a chamber, low-ceilinged, circular, and cut into the earth with disturbing precision. The walls were lined with shelves, each one meticulously stacked with small cloth bundles, none larger than a child's head. Each bundle was tagged with a strip of paper bearing an initial and a date written in tight, almost ornamental cursive. Murphy stepped forward slowly, noting the unnatural dryness of the space. The air did not smell of mold or decay, but of something sterile, like cold stone and faded vinegar. The temperature was noticeably higher than the surface, and no wind passed through, though his lantern flame flickered sideways, as if reacting to a breath not his own. On the far side of the chamber, a second shelf held objects less uniform: beads, thimbles, buttons, and items carved from bone and horn. Several were placed in bowls filled with a substance that had hardened into waxy, amber-colored layers. Murphy touched one and recoiled. It was warm to the touch, though no source of heat existed. The others joined him one by one. They spoke little. Stoke began to take inventory aloud, his voice thin and brittle. He counted 43 bundles on the main shelves and 32 more on the lower. Heppel instructed them to document everything, yet forbade the removal of any item until further notice. "We are not equipped to interpret," he said, "only to record." Later that afternoon, as the team prepared to ascend, Murphy noticed something else. Behind one of the lower shelves, a sliver of wall had cracked slightly, revealing a hollow space. With some effort, they pried the shelving unit forward, exposing a tunnel barely 3 feet wide. It had been dug by hand, no tool marks, only the uneven rhythmic strokes of fingers and bone against clay. The tunnel continued for approximately 12 feet before curving sharply to the right and ending in a rounded alcove. There, in that final recess, lay 3 figures, seated cross-legged, backs against the wall, hands resting on their knees. They were dressed in government-issued winter coats, now discolored with age, and each wore a strip of cloth tied across the mouth, knotted at the nape. Their eyes were open. Dr. Murphy examined the bodies and recorded the following in his report: no decomposition, no sign of trauma, no insects, no lesions. Limbs remained supple, pupils contracted as if exposed to sudden light. Stoke retrieved a tag from the jacket of the center figure. It read, "Wahinajin W2 Feb 1881. Heppel ordered the chamber resealed." That evening, all personnel involved in the discovery were placed under provisional gag order, pending review by military intelligence. Heppel filed a telegram to Washington stating that a previously undocumented burial chamber had been found and secured. He used the term archival vault, avoiding words like grave or crypt. But within 24 hours, the chamber's existence had spread through the ranks. Whispers took shape. 2 nights later, a second chamber was uncovered. It was not stumbled upon, nor was it searched for. Instead, it was revealed by accident after a storage shack collapsed during a storm. Beneath the debris, a second hatch, identical in size and design, was found already unlocked. This chamber was deeper and more elaborate, its walls marked with vertical scratches that formed no legible language but repeated at regular intervals. Inside were 16 wooden stools arranged in a circle, each one scorched at the seat. In the center lay a rectangular pit filled with blackened stones and a single iron rod driven vertically into the earth. On one stool, a wool coat had been folded precisely, with a ring placed atop the collar. The ring was gold, bearing the initials EM scratched crudely into the inner band. Dobbin's journal, still held in Chicago, had described a dream of a circle of silent figures and a smell of heated coins. The similarities were not lost on the few who had read it. Major Heppel, under visible strain, ordered both sites permanently sealed and placed guards around the perimeter. But that same week, 2 guards deserted. One was found hiding in the stable, incoherent and shoeless. The other was never located. Heppel submitted his resignation in writing on October 19th, citing irreconcilable moral conflict. He was escorted from the fort 2 days later, carrying only a leather folder and a travel voucher. No replacement commander was appointed. Instead, an external inspection team arrived under quiet orders, consisting of 2 civilian legal observers, a Catholic liaison, and a chemist from the Army Medical Museum. The team conducted a review over 4 days and took several items from the chamber, including 3 bundles and a portion of the hardened resin from the bowls. Their full report was never filed, but one observer, Father Lucien Gravois, kept a personal notebook. It survived only because he sent a portion of it to a seminary in Baltimore for translation, suspecting the writing on the chamber walls might contain ancient liturgical roots. In the margin of his final page, beneath a copied symbol from the second chamber, Gravois had written, "This is not burial, this is containment." Voce dici. Now continue with Chapter 3, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Confrontation or Discovery. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, du denmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 3, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles Longa Horror Disa. By the end of October 1881, Fort Yates operated under a different rhythm. Orders came less frequently, and when they did, they arrived through intermediaries, civilian riders, not military dispatch. Patrols were shortened. Daily logs grew vague. The chain of command loosened as the personnel remaining at the post began to divide themselves by unspoken lines, those who had entered the chambers and those who had not. Those who had entered became quieter, slower in their movements, and prone to lengthy stares. Several were reassigned or discharged for fatigue and emotional instability. One clerk, Elmer Stoke, attempted to transcribe the names from the paper tags recovered from the chamber shelves. His notes deteriorated quickly from neat columns to looping, spiraled scrawls. By the first week of November, Stoke had ceased speaking entirely. He sat for hours in the old telegraph room, hands pressed flat against the desk, facing a wall stripped of all equipment. His final written message, sent via wire to a contact in Deadwood, was recorded at 2:17 a.m. and consisted only of the phrase, "The entries go backward now." A week later, the file marked Block 6 Inquiry disappeared from the command office. The key to the records drawer was found in the chapel's font. In Chicago, the laboratory tasked with analyzing the resin from the bowls reported unusual findings. The sample, once solid, had begun to liquefy during transit. By the time it arrived, it moved sluggishly inside its sealed vial. The report described its texture as neither plant nor animal, and its odor as damp wool, bloodstone, and sugar root. When exposed to flame, it did not burn but darkened and released a fine ash that clung to the edges of the glass, like smoke frozen in place. The chemist in charge, Dr. R. Willard Main, sent the residue to the Smithsonian with an accompanying note, "Structure unknown, possibly fossilized biological tissue, rehydrated." No reply was documented. In the days following, 3 members of the inspection team that had visited the fort failed to return scheduled correspondence. Father Lucien Gravois was the only one to send a letter post-visit. His final message, dated November 12th, was addressed not to his superior but to his brother, a stonecutter in Baltimore. In it, he included a sketch of the circle of stools and described in precise terms the dimensions and acoustics of the second chamber. He noted, "The shape of the room affects the shape of the voice. You do not speak inside. You echo differently. You feel your own words come back to you, changed." The letter arrived with a second envelope. It contained a single piece of paper, folded 3 times with a phrase written in Lakota script, and then transliterated in Latin. "He who listens enters." That phrase appeared again weeks later, etched into the underside of a ration crate found in the fort storage yard. The crate had not been part of any known shipment. It contained no food, only layered bundles of cloth, each one stuffed with dried plants, animal bones, and a ring of what appeared to be pressed human teeth fused into a circular band. The teeth were adult-sized. 32 perfectly formed, no signs of decay. That same morning the chapel bell rang, though no one was inside. The clapper had been removed 3 years earlier. By mid-November the fort was unofficially shut down. Administrative presence dwindled to a skeleton crew, and the surrounding lands were declared transitional reservation territory pending reassignment. The families still residing near the former Block 6 area began to leave. Not all of them gave notice. Their dwellings were left swept and intact, windows covered from the inside, fires fully extinguished. One final investigation team was sent in early December, this time under the authority of the Department of War's Civilian Review Board. The team was led by Darius Hinch, a geographer with experience in mineral surveys and a reputation for discretion. Accompanying him were 2 assistants, both contracted surveyors with no prior military affiliations. They entered Fort Yates on December 3rd. Within 3 days they filed a partial report. It described their efforts to triangulate the location of the 2 known chambers using soil compaction patterns and architectural sketches provided by earlier investigators. What they found instead was a third structure, neither a chamber nor a tunnel, but a large dome-shaped cavity 15 feet below ground, previously undiscovered due to collapsed surface brush and false terrain fill. The dome was unlike the previous sites. It had no door. It was accessed through a vertical shaft sealed with a disc of hand-packed clay, clearly tampered with in the past, but reset with deliberate care. Inside, the air was dry and pulseless. The walls of the dome were smooth, not carved but formed, shaped through compression and pressure. No tool marks were present. The interior surface reflected light unevenly, as though dusted with mica or ground pearl. At the center lay an octagonal platform raised 2 feet from the floor. Upon it stood a wooden desk, unadorned, and a ledger with a cracked leather binding. The ledger was open. Its pages contained names written in multiple scripts, Latin, Lakota, and others unknown, arranged in columns with numerical annotations beside each line. Some names repeated, others were crossed out, then re-entered several lines lower. One name appeared 37 times, Wahinajin, W. On the final page, a symbol was drawn in charcoal, a ring of jagged lines with 7 equidistant breaks and a vertical line passing through its center. Beneath the symbol, a date, February 3rd, 1881. As the investigators prepared to ascend, one assistant, Joseph Bridger, noticed something wedged between the platform and the floor. It was a child's slate, the kind used in the reservation schoolhouse, its writing surface worn but intact. Scratched into it, not chalked, was a phrase in shallow lines. We still remember when they stopped calling. That night, Hinch and his team sealed the dome entrance with stone and clay. No markings were left above ground. They returned to Bismarck by sled and departed east by rail the next morning. Their final notes, submitted to the department's archive, recommended no further excavation, citing subterranean instability and historical boundary conflict. No follow-up was approved. Weeks later, a shipment arrived in Chicago, addressed to the Sentinel offices, postmarked from St. Louis. Inside was a box containing Bridger's field notes, several soil samples, and a torn fragment of the ledger's final page. The symbol had been partially burned, but still visible beneath the char. Alongside it, scrawled in Bridger's own hand, "This was not a place. This was a sentence. Voce dis, now continue with Chapter 4, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script consequences and legacy. Report the outcome, arrests, closures, trials, political or social changes. Show how the community and collective memory dealt with the case in the following years. Conclude with an enigmatic and unsettling final sentence that leaves a lingering doubt in the viewer's mind. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify, do not use full capital words, do not use forbidden characters, ditiudi, Suesibon lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 4, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3. Roterista. Ingles Longa Horror. Dice. By the spring of 1882, the name Fort Yates had been scrubbed from most new military memoranda. Its designation on transport maps was changed to Camp Y, and supply lines were rerouted through Fort Lincoln. The reason cited was logistical efficiency, yet among those who had passed through the fort in the preceding 2 years, there was no doubt the change was a deliberate step toward erasure. No formal arrests were ever made. There were no trials, no commissions, no press conferences. The personnel involved were either reassigned to remote outposts or discharged on grounds of mental unfitness, often without pension. Dr. Reynold Murphy left the service under voluntary early retirement, his final report sealed and misfiled under medical case studies. He was last seen in St. Paul, speaking to a pharmacist about mineral antiseptics for non-responding tissue. He died in 1887. His obituary listed him only as a former Army doctor, with no mention of Dakota Territory. Clark Elmer Stoke was committed to a private facility in Topeka, where he lived another 6 years under the name Edward Stone. According to an attending nurse, he wrote daily in small notebooks, copying the same symbols over and over until the paper tore beneath the pressure. The notebooks were kept in a locked drawer. After his death, they were burned by hospital staff. The site of Block 6 remained unoccupied. In 1883, a federal land reassessment designated the area as unsuitable for development due to poor drainage and geological anomalies. Several of the cabins were dismantled and used for firewood. Others remained standing, their interiors sealed with packed earth. No markers were erected. By 1884, a few local settlers had attempted to homestead nearby. None remained longer than 1 season. A widow from Sioux Falls who briefly raised chickens near the old fort claimed her eggs were always empty, intact shells, but nothing inside. Her sons complained of dreams where their mouths filled with grit. The family moved back east after just 3 months. The story surfaced once more in 1885 when a delegation from the Dakota Historical Commission requested access to the fort's remaining structures for archival research. Their request was approved, but when they arrived they found the buildings stripped, not by weather or time but by precision. Every ledger, filing cabinet and desk had been removed, nails taken from the walls, chalkboards wiped clean. One building had its walls removed plank by plank, then reassembled facing inward, as though to seal something within. Their report, later published in a restricted bulletin, concluded that no recoverable record of Fort Yates's administrative activity remains beyond quartermaster receipts and topographical surveys. Of the 119 names listed in the 1880 census for Block 6, only 8 appeared in future documentation. All were infants at the time, and none could be verified through living kin. In 1886, a missionary named Samuel Verret, who had served in the northern agencies, submitted a private petition to the Department of the Interior requesting acknowledgement of the vanished Lakota families as unresolved wards. His request was denied. The denial letter included a curious line, "No further enumeration necessary, closure affirmed." That same year, the ledger fragment bearing the repeated entries of Wahinajin W was displayed briefly at a private gathering of archivists in Chicago. It was shown not as evidence, but as an example of redundant clerical error, proof of how repetition, even on official documents, could obscure truth. The fragment was returned to its envelope and never catalogued. From 1887 onward, references to Fort Yates began to fade from public records. Its location on government maps was either omitted or misnamed. In school textbooks published in the Dakotas after statehood in 1889, the Standing Rock Agency was described without mention of its subdivisions. The Block 6 annex never appeared again. By the early 1890s, the few remaining soldiers who had been stationed at the fort were nearing retirement. Those who spoke of the events were quietly discredited. One was reported to have given a lecture at a rural grange hall in Iowa in 1891, describing rooms where breath stayed too long in the air. His audience walked out before he could finish. He died 2 months later, interstate and buried under the wrong name. The only official structure still visible by the end of the decade was the chapel, its steeple cracked but intact. A traveling merchant in 1891 reported stopping to rest near the ruins and hearing faint bells at dusk. He found no clapper inside the tower, only a pile of folded garments placed neatly on the altar. The garments matched those described in earlier fort logs, school uniforms and mission coats folded by size, smallest to largest. In the decades that followed, no memorial was raised. The few Lakota families who remained in the vicinity never spoke of Block 6. When asked, elders replied only that it was where the counting stopped. And in a schoolteacher's ledger, discovered in a private attic in Pierre in 1936, a forgotten roll call from January 1881 was found. Every name on the list had been scratched out in pencil. In their place, written in the margin, one sentence remained. They took their language with them. Vocedis now continue with Chapter 4, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Consequences and Legacy. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. Attention! This is the final part of the script. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, bio. Choice lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of Chapter 4, Part 2, include this text exactly as written. Text, write only and exactly Chapter 4, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3, Rote Rista Ingles Longa Horror. Dice. In the years that followed, the memory of Block 6 was reduced to rumor. The site, once marked on Army quartermaster maps, was omitted from every federal registry after 1890. What had once been rows of cabins and mission buildings became a stretch of overgrown scrubland, avoided by hunters and travelers alike. Local guides stopped offering routes through the area. Stagecoach trails detoured by several miles, citing poor road conditions, though no surveys confirmed it. For the Lakota descendants scattered across reservations in South Dakota and Nebraska, the names once tied to the vanished settlement became phantoms in their own genealogies. Family trees showed abrupt breaks. Oral histories paused when questions reached the winter of 1881. Elders referred only to the ones we did not bury. In tribal registries, a notation was made beside several surnames. No further trace. Last seen Cannonball. No official effort was ever made to restore these names to public record. By the early 20th century, the only formal mention of the Fort Yates anomaly appeared in a limited-run Army monograph cataloguing discontinued military posts. The entry was less than a paragraph. It stated, decommissioned due to structural instability and logistical redundancy, adjacent civilian activities suspended, land held in indefinite abeyance. The accompanying map showed a shaded area labeled unsurveyed. It was the only section in the entire Dakota Territory marked so. In 1912, a geologist working with the Bureau of Mines came across the area while conducting a mineral sweep. His field notes, preserved in a university archive in Rapid City, contain 2 passages of interest. The first describes inexplicably symmetrical mineral depletion patterns in the soil, forming circular dead zones where nothing grew beyond. Waist-high scrub. The second is more personal. The air here tastes of metal and mold even in sunlight. The wind does not cool, it presses. He did not return to the site. In 1924, during a short-lived initiative to catalogue unmarked burial grounds in the Plains states, a researcher named Helen Fahey attempted to correlate reports of missing native populations with recorded grave data. Her correspondence with regional agencies was mostly unanswered. One reply from a retired clerk in Pierre offered a brief and handwritten note. "We did not forget them. We were told to skip them." The packet Fahey assembled, titled Gaps in Enumeration, Dakota Territory, 1879-1886, was never published. It sits unprocessed in a library vault in Minneapolis, indexed under civilian census anomalies. Among its contents is a copy of a page from the original Block 6 ration log. The ink is faded, but beneath the last entry, February 3, 1881, someone had added in a different hand a simple mark, a circle, no name, no date, just the shape. In 1941, a Lakota man named Edward C. Chasinghawk wrote to the Office of Indian Affairs requesting information about his grandfather, whose name had been passed down only as Wicasa. The reply he received stated that no individual by that name appeared in any official record. No land allotment, no tribal affiliation, no death certificate. Included with the letter was a copy of a reservation map, annotated in red. Block 6 was marked with a question mark and the word void. Edward Chasinghawk never pursued the matter further. In a private memoir he later wrote for his grandchildren, he described walking the ground once. "It felt like standing where a bell used to ring," he wrote. "You know it was loud, but you never heard it." By the time Standing Rock became a focal point for mid-century political activism, Fort Yates had been rebuilt in name only. A new administrative center emerged near the original site, bearing no physical trace of the 1881 structures. Paved roads now crossed what had once been sealed entrances and sunken courtyards. The buildings were modern, whitewashed, flat-roofed, yet staff reported odd issues: electrical failures in new wiring, warped paper in file drawers, condensation on clean glass with no change in weather. The local janitorial contractor refused to clean after dark, citing something not right in the air. None of this made it into the maintenance logs. In 1977, during an oral history project conducted by students from the University of North Dakota, a woman named Leona Firecloud shared a story her grandmother used to tell about a place where everyone turned their mouths to the earth. It was a place, she said, where voices could not be raised and even animals kept away. Asked where it was, she simply pointed south. "They didn't die," she said. "They were taken from the counting." In 1981, on the centennial of the disappearance, no public observance occurred. The silence persisted, until in 1993, a Lakota schoolteacher named Anna Lee Eagle found a locked drawer in the basement of the old tribal office during renovations. Inside were documents mislabeled as surplus, a single census roll, and a bound volume marked Chapel Records. Most of it was illegible from water damage. But one page survived. It listed 23 names, ages ranging from 2 to 61. Beside each was a word, given. The next column was blank. At the bottom, a signature had been scrubbed with acid. Only 2 letters remained. W. Then, in 2006, construction began on a new cultural center along the river's edge, not far from the site of the vanished cabins. Excavation crews broke ground and immediately struck dense, layered earth. Beneath it were rows of what at first appeared to be sedimentary stone, round, pale, compressed into precise intervals. A geologist brought in for consultation ran a finger along one surface and stopped. The texture was not mineral, it was enamel. The site was closed the next day. No report was issued. To this day, the 119 names never re-entered the official federal record. Their absence remains undocumented, their return forbidden, their memory preserved only in the margins of misspelled ledgers and folded paper sealed with dust. And every winter, without fail, a line of frost appears across the old reservation map. One thin curve tracing the edge of a place no one dares name. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.